In any discussion or investigation of religion or civilization, the ancient Mediterranean plays a key role. If you want to understand Islam, how it spread throughout North Africa and into Europe at one point, the origins of Judaism, the creation of Christianity, or perhaps the nature of the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. All of these have one thing in common. They're inexplicable without understanding the Mediterranean. Why is the Mediterranean so essential to understanding the growth and spread of Western civilization and indeed world religion in general? Before answering that question, just stop for a minute and ask us what Mediterranean means. It's a Latin word, medius, and the genitive plural of terra, terrarum, in the middle of all the lands, meaning the continents. It's the only sea in the world that unites three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. It's a translation from a Greek word mesogeus, the land in the middle land. Something strange about the Mediterranean Sea, though. Think about it for a minute. It's enormous. It's from the Straits of Gibraltar in the west all the way eastward to the edge of the Black Sea is about 2,400 miles. And yet, it's entirely, at least until the 19th century, with the digging of the Suez Canal, it's entirely closed. There's only one way in and out in antiquity. For 25 centuries of Western civilization, only one way in and 8 miles straight at Gibraltar. It's a deep sea. Averages about 5,000 feet in depth, and it's very rich in sea life. It's a calm and protected sea. It's got about 300 islands. You know the big ones, Sicily, the biggest, and then Sardinia and Corsica, and Crete and Malta. But they're not just numerous, but they're strategically located. So if you want to go from Greece to Africa, you can stop halfway in Crete. And so the Mediterranean was navigable very easily because there were stepping stones, so to speak, between the three continents. So what makes the Mediterranean so essential to the creation of religion and civilization? In a word, climate, location, and the peculiar civilizations of those three continents. Let's take climate. Now, there is a word called Mediterranean. What does Mediterranean mean? It means that there is a period in the winter of about just 2 months where the temperature at night goes below freezing. That allows deciduous fruit trees to grow and thrive. And yet, you don't have cold temperatures at critical times in March and April that can destroy blooms and make it almost impossible to grow fruit trees, fruits, and olives as well. So you have the best of both worlds in a Mediterranean climate. Enough cold weather to shock the tree into dormancy, but not too much to destroy the developing crop in the spring. In addition, you have a warm but not a moist climate. You don't have problems with rotting, mold, fungus, tropical deluges, flooding to the same degree that you do in the tropics. And this is very important. Unlike the Baltic region or Northern Europe, you have enough days of 70 degrees and over, 65 and over, from March all the way to November that allow people to participate outdoors. Think of it for a minute. If you want to have a constitutional government in Athens, where are you going to put 7,000 people in the pre-engineering phase where civilizations did not know how to span great indoor distances? You can put them outside and they can deliberate in a way that would be absolutely impossible in St. Petersburg or Stockholm. In addition, we have to think of climate in terms of human investment and capital. While people in the Mediterranean for much of the year, 9 to 10 months out of the year, were able to concentrate on outdoor activity, the people either in the tropics or in the northern climates were not, and they had to spend more money therefore. They had to protect themselves against constant flooding in the tropics, and in places as diverse as northern Germany or Norway or western Russia, they had to spend a lot of capital in providing constant fuel in the winter to heat their homes, and they had to have much more investment in clothing. They didn't have as many clear days for construction. If you're going to build a temple in Italy versus building a temple in Sweden, you can see that you're going to have a lot more time to do so in a Mediterranean climate, and you're going to have a lot less investment in efforts to keep warm. So there were innate advantages in a Mediterranean climate. The second question is location. Now, as I said, Panama is ideally located. It's between the Pacific and the Atlantic. It unites North and South America, but it doesn't achieve the same level of influence as the Mediterranean Sea does. Nor does the Caribbean Sea, nor does the Baltic Sea. Because while these seas can unite two continents, they do not unite three continents. And more importantly, it's the continents in question that they unite. For a variety of reasons, in the first millennia BC, first 2 millennia BC, there's not a lot of civilization going on in South and North America. There is in Asia, but it's in isolation. But if we go and look at the Mediterranean, we have not just the three great religions emerging, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, within a 1,000-year time span, but we have monumental civilizations. In Egypt, in the so-called Fertile Crescent, civilizations as diverse as the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and then we have the Hittites in Anatolia, we have the Persian Empire, and then the great classical civilizations. All of them taking advantage of this connectivity. And we should remind ourselves at the very outset that in the ancient world, in the pre-industrial age, before internal combustion engines, it's about 10 times as cheap to navigate by water than it is by land. So envision this Mediterranean as a superhighway that's going to connect three continents, and it's going to allow them to trade with one another, to learn from one another, to fight one another, and this rich interaction is going to create a dynamism that's not present in places in the north, or places in the Caribbean, or places in the Sea of Japan. But more importantly, think of these continents also as reverse funnels. In other words, all of the riches of Africa, whether it's precious metals or diamonds or ivory or slaves in the ancient world, can come from the south to the north to ports. In the classical world, they would be as diverse as Carthage or Alexandria. Or they can come up through great rivers like the Nile, and then they hit the Mediterranean coast, and they can be very cheaply transported either eastward or northward on this globalized highway, so to speak. And the same is true of precious spices, silks from China and India that can come through Asia Minor, and then at places like Miletus or Ephesus, they can enter the superhighway. And in terms of Northern Europe, whether it's timber or iron ore or tin or copper, they can come down from places as diverse as Marseille or in the Dalmatian coast or Rome, or they can come through the Rhone Valley on rivers. So the Mediterranean is sort of a collecting pot, as it were, of all the diverse natural resources of three great continents, and they all collide in one place. And this makes it unique in the way that other strategically located places are not. But there's a third reason why we should appreciate the Mediterranean. It's just different than other inland seas. It's enclosed. 8 miles wide at the entry at Gibraltar, and then you can go for 2,400 miles, at least before the 19th century, in the Suez Canal, where there's absolutely no other outlet. And this had a number of ramifications. Number one, it meant that while there's always currents and rough seas, currents and rough seas were far less frequent in the Mediterranean. With a Mediterranean climate, you could start to develop commerce with oared ships. That's a fancy word of just saying you could row. You didn't have to sail. If you put a galley or a trireme off the coast of Panama on the Atlantic side, or you put one off the coast of Denmark, or you put one in the North Korean Sea, the chances are that it would swamp or it would be too cold. Not in the Mediterranean. It was calm, it was enclosed, and allowed early civilizations to communicate and trade and travel from one to the other without worry about rough seas. And it really developed the entire idea of ocean navigation. We're going to get back to that because it was a double-edged sword once the New World opened up. So let me just review. The Mediterranean was unique and was seen as such by classical civilizations and their antecedents in Egypt and the Fertile Crescent, and it was because of this weird location that it united three different continents, and these three different continents were especially rich, and the sea was enclosed, and out of that became this dynamism. Now, here's the key to maximizing the use of the Mediterranean. You have to have control of the entire shoreline. That would mean if a system could control all of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean in Anatolia, and the Holy Land and come up through the Balkans and then Italy and Western Europe. That was all under one political system, and it was interconnected with key islands like Cyprus, Crete, or Malta. Then people could trade freely, and you could create a globalized system, and you wouldn't have to worry about things like piracy or rival kingdoms. The problem with that idea, that globalized idea, it's almost impossible to carry off because it would require one particular state to have influence in 3 different continents. That never happened except in one case, and that was Rome. So much of the story of civilization in the Mediterranean is the story of the growth and influence of the Roman Empire. Let's review a minute. After the fall of Egypt and after the efforts of Hellenic civilization through Alexander the Great to spread culture, we do see signs that the Greek speakers had control of the Eastern Mediterranean, and for a while they had a control of the Egyptian coast and of course the Greek coastline, and that was about it. They never had influence west of Sicily, nor did the Phoenicians earlier, nor did the Persians earlier. Rome came along, and in a series of wars spanning 2 centuries, it achieved the almost unthinkable, and that was it was able to unite this 2,400 mile corridor, which is the Mediterranean, under one particular economic, social, cultural, and military system. And we can stop for a second and think how they did that. It seems almost impossible, because when we say Rome, we're talking about what? 4 million Italian agrarians in 1/4 of the Italian peninsula at 216 in a life and death struggle with a very sophisticated, wealthy Carthaginian empire being invaded by a genius like Hannibal. And yet in a series of wars from 266 to 146, what we call the 3 Punic Wars, Rome, as I said, did the unthinkable. It defeated Carthage, and almost immediately that changed the complexion of Italian culture. Sicily became Roman in a way that it had never been before. It had always been Carthaginian or earlier Greek. Rome gained access to the Iberian Peninsula, and it gained Carthaginian holdings in what is today Tunis, Morocco, and Algeria. And that meant that Rome was starting, at least in the Western Mediterranean, to create an interconnected lake, so to speak. There were key tessera missing in this mosaic, but they had the original idea. And whether this was deliberate, somebody in a strategic planning session in the Forum, or a key senator, a Scipio, said, you know what, we got to take over the entire Mediterranean, because if we can do that, we can create a globalized system of trade. I don't think so. It was probably haphazard. But after Rome developed this ability to defeat sophisticated cultures like Carthage, then it reapplied those lessons again and again. At almost the same time it was fighting in the 2nd and 3rd Punic Wars against Carthage, it completed the domination of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the Balkans and Greece in the so-called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Macedonian Wars. So if we take an arbitrary date, 146 BC, we see the destruction of Carthage, and we see the complete finalization of Roman Greece and the Roman Balkans. And then things start to accelerate, because the Roman legions now are coming into their form. The Senate is starting to think strategically. Roman systems of trade, commerce, economic productivity are starting to be systematized, and we're starting to see the origins of an imperial system. By the time of the late Republic, the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, Hispania, Spain and Portugal, have been brought into the system inland. Due to Caesar's Gallic Wars, he annexes the province of what we would call now Belgium and France, and that gives you another access point in the Rhone Valley at Marseille and elsewhere on the French coast into the Mediterranean system. There's a series of wars in Numidia, the Jurgantine Wars, where the next strip of North Africa eastward, all the way to what is now eastern Libya and Egypt, is pacified and brought into the system. Asia Minor and the Holy Land, and a series of wars of the 1st and 2nd centuries BC are brought in. Mithridates and the Black Sea kingdoms are brought in the 1st century BC. And the final ingredient, of course, is the annexation of Cleopatra's Egypt at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And at that point, this 200-year process is pretty much complete. In other words, if we were to go along the coast of the Mediterranean, let's start in Italy, work our way into France, to Spain, hop over this 8-mile channel to what is now Morocco. We have Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. We go northward into what is now Israel and Syria, Lebanon, Syria, all the way into southern Turkey, up the coast of Asia Minor, going around into Thrace, down the Greek coastline, all the way around. And then we get into Dalmatia and back to Rome. We've got 29,000-mile circumference. And this is what the Romans called Mare Nostrum, RC. It was a realization of something the Greeks had dreamed of. Plato, the philosopher, in his famous dialogue, the Phaedo, said the Greeks are like frogs sitting around a pond looking at the Mediterranean. But once this Roman system was finalized, think for a minute, it allowed a early version of what we know as globalization. It was the first globalization. That meant that Roman expertise, whether it was architectural, building a dome like the Pantheon, or whether it was artistic, a Corinthian capital, or the ability to capture realistically a portraiture on a wood painting, or it was sophisticated roads, or it was constitutional systems of government, or it was the ability to write in novels or plays, or more importantly, scientific treatises, that information could be dispersed throughout this system at travel rates of 2 to 3 weeks. You could get from Gibraltar if you were going eastward to the Black Sea, and maybe 5 to 6 weeks back from the Black Sea to Gibraltar, and 2 days from north to south in some of the routes, especially from southern Italy to Tunisia, or from Alexandria through Crete, or from Tripolis, Leptis Magna through Crete up to Greece. And so we start to see these capitals, Alexandria, Egypt, New Carthage, Leptis Magna, Rome, of course, Ravenna, Athens, Miletus, Ephesus, and they serve as sort of nexuses for silk, spices, slaves, precious metal, and they throw them out in the Mediterranean and having exchanges about architecture, engineering, science. So a doctor like Galen can say, you know what, I'm going to take a voyage to Alexandria and talk to some Greek doctors. They're united under a common Latin tongue. They can speak a tribal language in Northern Europe. They can speak, of course, Greek. They can speak a Punic language, but they all know Latin as well. And that's a systemized global method of communication. The practical results are, if today we were going to walk the ruins of Leptis Magna in Libya, as I did in 2006, or if you're going to spend 3 days to try to wander through the vast expanse of Miletus and Ephesus, either one, or if you go to Pompeii, there's a commonality. You may think you're in Libya, and you are as soon as you leave the site of Leptis Magna. You know you're in Turkey when you're outside the gates of Ephesus, and you know you're in Italy when you try to go into Naples from Herculaneum or Pompeii, but you're really not once you're inside those sites. What do I mean by that? The roads are the same. The language is the same. The architectural components of the Corinthian order are the same. There's going to be amphitheaters, there's going to be aqueducts, there's going to be roads, there's going to be harbors, and they're all going to be the same. Aelius Aristides, the Greek essayist, said these cities are in constant competition with each other, especially during the period of the so-called 5 good emperors, that mystical period roughly from about 96, 97 AD all the way to the end of the 2nd century AD, when there was really Marcus Aurelius, Antonius Pius, Trajan, Hadrian, and Nerva working backwards. And we had these good emperors where there were not a lot of internal wars, and this system really came to a refinement. And a person, whether he was born in Thrace or whether he was born in the Atlas Mountains or whether he was born in the Balkans, he could find a way to get to the port, and then he was a citizen, so-called, of the world. So Rome united the Mediterranean in a way that nobody ever before, and they had tried, was unable, and nobody afterwards had been successful either. And just as the Mediterranean explains the rise of Roman civilization and our first globalization and quantum leaps in the material culture and knowledge of civilization, so the breakup of this system explains in many cases the collapse of Rome. And it started, as you know, with the tribal invasions from Northern Europe and Eastern Europe, what we today would call Poland or eastern parts of Germany, where these Germanic tribes started to migrate across the Rhine, across the Danube into Italy. And the first major collapse of Roman society, of course, was the onset of the Visigoths. In 410 AD, where a Germanic-speaking tribe came in, sacked Rome, and then moved on toward Hispania and created the Visigothic kingdom of Spain. That took out of the globalized system the key ports in Spain and the key ports in Portugal, and it meant that the system was starting to crack now. More importantly, in 455, there is a Vandal invasion, another tribal group from probably what's today Western Poland. They sack Rome in 455, but even more importantly, they migrate on to North Africa, and they set up for almost 100 years a Vandal kingdom. That takes out what is today Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Let's stop for a minute because we want to know why Rome falls. Well, one of the reasons Rome falls is that suddenly you can't import wheat from Tunisia or Morocco easily into Sicily, into Rome. And suddenly, if you're going to trade from Spain, you can't do it any longer. Or say that you've got a load of wine coming into Rome, suddenly you're going to be facing Vandal pirates that can get on the Mediterranean. So the system is starting to fragment, and with that fragmentation, goods and services, communication, knowledge itself is starting to be lost. It would be as if in the United States, when we talk about 50 states, that suddenly people in Southern California could not access themselves on the internet or could not drive to Arizona, or UCLA could not communicate with UC Berkeley, or Stanford University was cut off from Harvard or Yale or Princeton. When this system starts to break apart, then you have enclaves rather than syntheses of knowledge. And this started, as I said, in the 5th century AD in earnest. There was another critical landmark breaking up of the concept of unified ancient Mediterranean. That was the dissection of the Roman Empire between an Eastern Byzantine Greek-speaking empire headquartered at the new city of Constantinople in the 4th century AD, and the traditional Rome-Ravenna Western Empire. Now this occurred as early as under Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century AD, and under Constantine and the founding of Constantinople in the early 4th century AD, you now had bifurcated Roman control. And this would only get more serious, so that when the Western Empire is, besieged by Vandals and Visigoths, and then finally the final Gothic sack in 476, there's not an Eastern Empire to aid it, because they have been estranged. They are concentrating on the Eastern Mediterranean area, Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia, and they're not there, and they cannot bring legions to the West. That was a landmark decision when the empire was split. Moving on, the rise of Islam in the 8th century, early 8th century, across the coast of North Africa was sort of the death knell to the notion of Roman uniformity and globalization. Remember that as Islam spreads out of Mecca and Medina, it goes into Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, across the Straits of Gibraltar. And that meant that even though these Gothic kingdoms that had set themselves up in Egypt, and even though the Byzantines had been very successful in trying to reincorporate this system of globalization under Justinian and his brilliant general Belisarius, in the 520s and 530s AD, they could not stop, their successors could not stop Islam. And so Islam cut off the Mediterranean in a very antithetical way. They were very much more uniform and successful than the Vandals that they replaced. So suddenly, and we're talking 710, 720, the successors to the Roman Empire, the Gothic and Northern European Christian occupiers of Italy, found themselves without access to the classical riches of Africa or Asia or Western Europe and Spain. So that marked a break. There was another civilization that tried to replicate what the Romans had did, and that was the Ottomans. The original Seljuk Turks had migrated west, sacked Constantinople and taken it in 1453 under a series of dynamic emperors. They tried to reconstruct the globalized empire, and they could not put the final pieces into play. France, Italy, they lost at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, and so they never quite got they got 75% of it, but never quite the entire Mediterranean, and finally they were defeated by the West. There's a final wrinkle that explains why the Mediterranean was so important in antiquity, but not in the Industrial Revolution, not in the late 15th to the so-called present age, and that was simply that the Mediterranean was paradoxical. Just as we said a small strait allowed a calm sea and protection against the Atlantic, it also meant isolation. So with the advent of ocean-going vessels, any of these European countries that had a western Atlantic port, Portugal, Spain, France, Holland, and especially Great Britain, they had access to the Atlantic, and in quantum leaps in the 1500s, they began to master the arts of transcontinental navigation by sea, and it makes the Mediterranean a backward lake, so to speak. They're still using galleys in 1600 at a time that a European on the coast is able to go in 6 to 7 weeks across the Atlantic and tap into the great riches, not only of North and South America, but go around the Cape of Good Hope and in a much cheaper, safer fashion, displace the old silk routes that dumped into the Mediterranean and go directly to India and China by sea. I'll end with a final paradox. If what I said was true, that the Mediterranean sort of lost out after the discovery of the New World, and perhaps because it was not a hallmark of Protestant religion in the way that Northern Europe was, why is it so important today? About 30% of the world's commerce takes place on the Mediterranean. Two reasons, I think. One, in the 19th century, they found a way out of the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea, and suddenly that meant that you didn't have to go around the Cape of Good Hope, and you could go right through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, and connect India and China with Northern Europe. And that created a renaissance. And then after World War II, of course, the great natural wealth in the world became oil. And much of the oil in the world was found in places as natural gas as diverse as Algeria, Libya, but especially in the Persian Gulf, and with the ability to put pipelines into the Red Sea or the Mediterranean, places through Syria or Saudi Arabia, the Mediterranean now became a place where Western countries could find oil and natural gas very cheaply. And so with the onset of modern globalization, the Mediterranean, in some sense, is starting to become reconnected. And we're at a dilemma today because we don't know whether the powers of globalization will make culture uniform in places like Damascus and Cairo and Rome and Lisbon, or that the present sectarian divides in religion, culture, East, West, Islam, Christianity will break it apart as it was in the Dark Ages. Where we're going to have a united Mediterranean or we're going to have a divided one, whichever way it'll be, it won't be new.